Bouchard. My first presentation, so I. I'm going to present Canadian Royalties as you've seen we invade. From the north, so you already have a good idea of the location of our mine. Just a little point. The photos that I have a lot of photos now. It comes from our calendar. It's Canadian Royalties employees who take photos, who submit photos to us for an annual calendar. So I thought it was good to include it in the presentation to give a little glimpse of mine. So who are we? But as we mentioned, as my colleague mentioned, we are in northern Quebec at 15 kilometers from Raglan. We are very close, so we are experiencing the same challenges. A more recent company too. We started in 2013. It's only to the brass. So an operation that is still younger than Raglan, for example, than many mining companies, an operation with a unique mine in northern Quebec. So we are nearly 1,000 workers in all, 750 of whom are our employees. We are currently operating 2,000 underground. We have an open pit mine. We are in a transition phase to be purely underground in 2025. For me, who started for people who know Canadian Royalties, we started purely as an open pit operation. So for us, to be there is still a thing. A big change in the way of doing things. Other point, I can maybe mention to know my history of the company. We were supposed to finish in 2023. That was the original mandate. We are up to 2035. For the lifespan. It continues to get longer, so we had to adapt quite quickly with these new realities. Because our investments were made over 111 shorter periods of time. Operation Open Pit, less can be technologically advanced. Operation Underground is another challenge. So against the connected mine presentation, I wanted to talk about where to start. Satellite causality in low orbit for remote sites. We mentioned a little bit earlier the democratization of private LTE technology. Then data warehouses, the centralization of information, these seem to be fairly generic points. But I would say that for notary companies that face the same challenges in terms of geographical location, these are things that even a few years ago, it would not even have been financially or technically feasible for us. Therefore, I think it's interesting to be able to share a little bit about what we have. Have we experienced? What are our challenges? Where do we stand? So, connected mines, where do you start? Because we have heard a lot about it from our colleagues in Raglan. We saw a little bit CEQI.se was doing for us. These were challenges that were relatively difficult to imagine that we could reach. As I mentioned to you until recently. We thought it was good, but we said to ourselves, it's not for us, it's too evolved. The cost of entry is too high. But in the end, by analyzing the needs, by looking at CEQI.se fact on the market, I decided to take an approach where we could identify certain technologies, certain investments, which at least allowed us to start moving in the right direction instead of waiting until we had the capacity to have a big project. That is, let's take the first step. Let's start in a certain direction. At least we're going to have moved forward, and then we'll allow VAPouvoir.se to build on that. So for me, it has been identify some quick returns on investment. Quick return on investment. I think that's pretty well known. I think that we have a bit of the problem in the mining sector. The conservative state, we don't dare. New technologies will advance. We may not dare to do it differently. And then the more traditional technologies, the costs are higher, so we tend to paralyze. At the same time, to seek out mature technologies. For me, it was something to have something proven. For me, that's important. It's fun sometimes to do labs. It's good when you can do labs. And we see it with the MISA group, we see it with the different partners, the people we have. There are technologies that have been tried and tested elsewhere. It minimizes our risk, it reduces acquisition costs, implementation costs. You also have to think ahead. What we realized, I will mention it later. Often, we wait until we do a big project before making investissement-sport.se, realize that we should have implemented the technology before, we could have done steps before. At the level of the network, at the level of procedures, at the level of needs analysis. It's important to think about it in advance, and then gradually roll out the capacity that is still there. Think gradually, what am I going to do in the future? But what is affordable for me? What I need to have the Cadillac when I leave? Maybe not, maybe it at least allows me to take a first step. And then use the technology in place to reduce the risk, simplify the deployment. Again, not to reinvent the wheel. Let's go and get the expertise, the knowledge, which is what has been brought by the other companies. In their studies, in their efforts. So we, on our side, part, in the projects in progress, that we have the monitoring of mobile equipment. I'm going to talk to you about things that you've probably heard about elsewhere, that we've seen on a large scale. But that for us, until recently, it was that had been put aside, data collection, predictive proactive maintenance. We made it with it. With Vision Link, for example, that was already collected. We realized that we had data from a lot of our equipment that was available, which were not used. We had to at least start collecting it, at least start collecting this data. Do we have a huge reliability project? And then positive maintenance for the moment? Not yet. But we don't collect the data now. It's just going to increase the price of admission in the future. Remote control ventilation is a good example. We started that. We had seen a lot of ventilation on demand, which is good, there are great savings. By asking questions with people in the field. Where is the first 80% of the savings? It's at least to control the ventilation. What did it take? Connect drives to the network a $2,000 and 1 cent Python Honor Hamel. We are not at the level of having only the final optimization, but in the zoo, in the previous mines, the ventilation is at 100% at all times. We hadn't even taken that first step, we hadn't dared to go there. Parquequan.se said. Directing we ask, it's too much for us, the payback is not there. We started to implement that. This is the partial operation of the equipment. We're starting to work on that. For next summer, our first equipment will arrive. Again, we have a mine, we have mines underground, the equipment exists. Now it's options that we buy. What are the needs? In full teleoperation operation. Much more complex. Can I have a buter who works 4 hours more per figure? I already have an interesting win. Why not start with that to prove the concept? Then go and find savings that will finance future projects. So these are examples that we are currently looking at. That we want to implement to many. In our case, it also allows us to prove the concepts. Then we know that it has already been validated elsewhere. One of the big changes, rule not experienced also in our case, then maybe in the case of other mining companies, other junior explorers. Satellite connectivity. I understand. For granted, as we were talking about in the city everywhere else, internet connectivity is not a problem. For us, for exports to James Bay exploitation remote, lack of connectivity or the cost of community to limit enormously what we could do in terms of intelligence, mine connected or intelligent to exploit existing technologies. It was a game changer when it went in. Raglan. We're quite recent, we're an opportunity. We were one of OneWeb's first customers in Canada. So the difference between a low orbit, a high orbit. We talked about the internet, we had 20 megabits. We are now with 500 megabits for 50% of the price of what we paid for 20 megabits. It allowed us, in the time of COVID, among other things, to integrate the cloud. It was technically not possible to be integrated into cloud technologies before, with its limitations, there. So we were losing a lot of potential. By not having access to technologies available to other customers in the South. That's the light forces the optical fiber. That's the second. But it shows the importance of having a good community. It's a technology that is more nascent. People know Starlink for the home, Starlink for the company too. It makes a big difference. It's very easy to deploy. Again, it allows you to go from a site that is completely isolated to a connected site. So the data that will connect kva.se, that will be shared, that will be able to be exploited. It makes a difference in the way we operate too. That we had, as we had mentioned before, when you work in connect the room mode. It's good, but it reopens a lot of doors with this kind of system. Well, just a little parenthesis on this. It gave us a general idea for people who haven't experienced this, who haven't already seen this. From what you see on the left, over there, the antenna with the crane, that's the smallest of the two we have. For the let's see the geostationary, that's for 20 megabits, then it couldn't be more than 20 megabits. That's 3.5 cubic meters, 0.8 m. The little antenna on the container on its own, it does that in lack everybody. It changes the approach we have. It reduces costs enormously. So is staff retention. It goes with the use of technology on the site, so that's changing. We are talking about autonomous mines, connected mines. We often think of the underground, in the production office. We don't think all the time with external people, management, external partners. It's part of the mix, so that's a huge enabler on that side. I think that for us, that's what allowed us to open doors for ourselves for that too. So I was going to mention a little bit that we don't expect to integrate in FOSS-native services. I'll talk about it a little bit later at the level of data warehouses. Video conferencing, real-time collaborative conferencing. Again, we take all this for, at post-pandemic levels. It didn't exist on our side at the mine site. It was a simple telephone, to have visuals. It was almost impossible. This has allowed us to find solutions that are not necessarily always promised. We're talking about offering technologies to more than many. It allows us to curb it. Precisely, deployments that should have been made. A promise that is much more expensive or impossible. It reopens the doors on that side. Private LTE. I don't hide it. But we looked again at what he was doing at our neighbor's house. LTE started to be implemented. The acquisition price, the acquisition cost, the location, that's what it is. Private LTE is all about, it's relatively recent. 2 years ago, I started to look at the case maybe a little more deeply. I realized that the costs had dropped a lot in the availability of players. It will increase. Then especially players who understood the mining world. Instead of trying to integrate technology, equipment that was made for telecommunications companies, we talked to people who had done it, what it was like to work in mining, who knew what it was like underground, who understood the challenges that came with it. Looking at that, I decided to start looking a little more at the possibility of to integrate this into our operations. We had seen a little bit of the challenges. Raglan had seen. We have a very nice collaboration with them on this in terms of telecommunications. So we were able to see a little bit. What are the challenges going to be? What will be the advantages? Then what could we do on our side to start our transition? To start the implementation without having to invest 345100000 to start. Have a development, a low-cost deployment, and then where it could help us. Sometimes, I've seen LTE projects. That the LTE project is an end in itself for us. For me, my vision of this is a communication medium. It is a data transmission medium like any other. How can I lift it? I have. If I approach it this way, it's point. End of it all. I can reduce my costs. I can use it wherever I need it. In collaboration with my other MISA technologies. So we talked about it. We mentioned at the level of the IoT, the devices. For me, it's something that really interested me. It's certain that in our sector, in our area, sector, it may be a little different than in the South. We don't have cell phone coverage, we have to provide it ourselves if we want it. Private LTE may take on another dimension, but the availability of IoT equipment, the ease of disconnecting on LTE, it's becoming a game changer versus what we have to do now, then deploy dedicated networks. Whether it's Wi-Fi, 19 cents, megahertz at great costs, for us it can be a saving on that side. Then it's data that we can't get at all because we don't have connectivity on the ground. It has advantages. You have to look too. The location positions. But for us, I think it makes sense by doing it gradually. What we saw, seen, what I observed, and which can be interesting in some other players as well, is as I mentioned, the systems are more than much. I've been in discussions with suppliers recently. We are talking about a core system between $100 and $200,000. We were talking about several $1,000. Now, 2 to 3 years. That's a barrier that is it is a mental number but also a real one. To those who have caused many companies not to look at this solution, it becomes more interesting. There are specific solutions for the mining industry. That's what we've seen in LTE liquid for the underground. It's an approach for in the mining sector, for this kind of technology, and it reassured us. We didn't start with something that was not suitable. It also facilitates the adoption of technology at the operational level. There are different other aspects, the unlicensed frequencies, the question of equipment. Maybe a little point on that, I often repeat. Maybe it's clear for the miner, sometimes for the suppliers, it's different. We operate a lot in CAPEX mode. When I hear subscriptions, I know, I have money this year. I don't know if I have it next year. I like to accommodate my equipment, I like to minimize my recurring costs. It may be different from many companies, but for me it's important. Then when I talk to suppliers like that, I ask them, I have to be able to acquire the equipment. I want to have it, I want it to belong to me. So we can see that. It's available. And maybe a little point in there, we did the deployments in parallel. Will LTE one day be the only thing we will deploy? Yes, but to minimize my risk. My VHA system works great. Why would I replace it day one? Start it slowly, start it in parallel. I minimize my risks, I minimize my investments. A very important point in this, if there are Genska.se throw themselves into this. Not neglect the wired network infrastructure. I heard it from the supplier too. They arrived in projects, and that's when they start unpacking fiber optics underground. For me, it's a no-brain. That's a lot. You have to make sure that you have a good base. So when you plan to connect it, it doesn't matter if it's been insulated. Look at your existing options, fiber optics, wired, Wi-Fi, you know that. Leverages CA.SE. Actually it connects the devices in the same way as LTE for me. My approach and for operations, I offer them the knowability for their needs. They don't need to have the law, to have to think about it's LTE or it's wired. For them they need to know that it's connected. That's our job at the IT level. It's our job at the organizational level to provide them with the right connectivity in the right place with the right mix. So on the LTE side underground, well that's exactly what we start. We started rolling out one LTE. I mentioned that as well. We were really surprised at the cost, it was still very reasonable. A big advantage, as we know, we deploy LTE, Liquifida for VHF. We deploy Loyalty Liquid. LTE on the side. It's the same technology, it's the same principe CA.SE, it is installed in a very similar way. It allows us to move quickly to the point where we deployed the LTE cable underground. We are currently doing so. We don't even have the core system yet. Because it's cheaper to put it there while we're in the development phase in our next mine than to wait, and then retrofit while we're in operation. So I took the challenge on that, but it's still, when we talked about you with people you size, we say, well, it's something we know. That's not that big of a barrier in terms of implementation, at least to begin with. We see into the future. We will be able to greater. We will be able to go further. When we go back to teleoperation, it came out different, but for the moment, well, the important thing for me is to bring communication to Earth. It is one of the mediums. For us, it was a name, Brunner, to get into it. The other point I wanted to mention, maybe a part that we talk less about, data collection. I have my colleagues Dennis Perrick who are here, who have helped us enormously in this, for several years. We tend to wait too long for a project to consume data. Core.se realize that we don't have the data to realize that we haven't made an effort, for many, maybe more companies. And people don't see the value of keeping the data. Till we have it. We have plans for the laundry. We realize that we don't have it, we can lose history. I took a bet in 2018, when we started with it. We had a request from management to get into a data warehouse system. We took a bet. I said, I want us to know the system as much as possible. It becomes our central point in terms of data collection. It sounds obscure, but the important thing is to know that all the systems brings data back to the power plants. What does it allow us to do after that? It allows us to have our data in a structured way. It allows us to keep the company's historical data. It allows us to look at subsequent projects of predictive maintenance, trend analyses, operating models, dashboards, and then to start with a history. We don't always have concrete examples at the beginning. But it's Benzo does the positive maintenance if you leave D1 with no data. So for us, what is important is to connect as many systems as possible. Collect the data. Collect it later, we'll see what we do with one of the points I mentioned. It's cheaper to archive data than to recreate it. So sometimes, small businesses, we tend to want to reduce our budgets as much as possible. We're going to keep only the minimum. We look at what the operations. I need a year, let the rest do it. I paid better for the store. When we talk about internet connectivity, but it allows us to rein in cheaper systems in the cloud to store data over the long term. We may not have the means to do so at the moment, that we may not have the equipment. But you have to open up a little bit. As a mining company, sometimes you have to look a little bit, see Equi.se done elsewhere. The cloud can be a good approach for that. But data for me is very important. All centuries, IoT, all vehicle data. All of a sudden, it's going to be very valuable to be able to go back into that data. In this data, then he began to kill models. So that's what we embarked on this. It was one of the big projects. I'm talking about grouping data. We started to make dashboards quite recently. The advantage is that at all the funds, we would leave. Then we said, well, yes. We have our data source. We don't start from zero. We have had external suppliers too, with providers with whom we worked with, who have said, oh well, we're going to have to start connecting your data sources. We say no, everything is already there. Oh well, we've just saved ourselves several months in the project. All these time savings, these substantial savings also in terms of money. The initial investment for us was to pay each time, because we went a little further ahead. In advance, we went to collect the data, then we grouped it together. Now it makes it easier for us to integrate the systems. Maybe another point also for the smallest companies. We don't all have any. SAP, we don't all have large integrated systems, we will see smaller systems. What I discovered with this is that it allows us to integrate different systems. With these data exchanges, these data sharing platforms, it allows us to go into software that may not be completely all the features but that are at the 10th of having software that works for us. Not to be forced to replace them but to do the integration back once again so that the operations have access to the data that need the results that need Kava.se. Concern with the present Technologica.se. They love their software, they love their platform. Putting no data integration back. Vehicle data collection. A vehicle data if I can go through a vision line to give it to me and not have to implement my own system. That's a substantial saving to get the same result, so for us, that was important. To push this approach because there's nothing worse than connecting a mine, and not to keep the data, to see only the live data. For me, that's basically if you're not ready to welcome this data. We will not have the advantage of going to connect all these sensors, all these facilities. We have to be ready to welcome it. Data is at the base. It's like the basic wired network communication. If the foundation is not ready, can pass the castle that we want, it will not last long. It's the same thing for me with the data colleague. So I want a little example. This is what we have created. Also, small point is that we have also realized that there are many applications that at the level of anger, at the level of data sharing, to go and host a software, several $100,000, years of implementation. Sometimes it's better to do something high, but custom made or with a provider. Seek out and connect our existing platforms to reinvent the wheel. My result I need? It's a source of data. That's what we did with the production database that we're currently delivering, which allowed us to bring together our different systems without changing the way we do things, and to come up with a centralized source of data. That would still have required substantial investments, to look for a ready-made solution externally. Again, for us, the important thing is that the data is gathered, that it is available centrally. It was on the goal. Well, we can work backwards to achieve the same result. So thank you very much for your time. It's very nice to have presented this. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.